All right, we are going to get started with this. On page 124, the question number 8 reads, a farmer spends much of her time outdoors and, as a result, has very tan skin. What would the hypothesis of inheritance of acquired characteristics say about the skin of her children and why? So who can tell me what Lamarck's idea would say about this farmer's children? What will their skin be like? Avery, go ahead. Her children will be tanned. That is the idea of inheritance of acquired characteristics. If an organism acquires a characteristic during their lifetime, according to this theory, it can be passed on to offspring. Now remember, at this point in time, we did not have understanding of cell biology and genetics like we do now. And so there was nothing to discredit this for a while because we didn't have any evidence that proved otherwise. So I just want to remind you that this theory has been, this mechanism has been rejected. So don't quote this as being the truth. This is just one idea that someone proposed that we now know is not the way inheritance works. The next question that we'll take a look at, we'll look at page 127 next. On page 127, I asked you to do the analysis questions. So analysis 1 says, flying fish use large pectoral fins to glide in air. Explain how A. Lamarck and B. Darwin might account for the origin of the large pectoral fins and the ability to glide. Now a question like this one, I will ask you this question again. I like this question because it's asking you with an example to describe the theories, not just to memorize something out of your textbook, but be able to take their idea and explain it with an example that's given. So I'm letting you know something like this question, where I give you an organism that you do not know about, that you couldn't possibly have memorized. I would ask you how both men, Lamarck and Darwin, would have explained evolution in this organism. So we're talking about these large pectoral fins and the ability to glide. Now I'll give you a choice. Would anyone like to start? You can pick Lamarck or you can pick Darwin, but I'd like to know how they would explain that these fish ended up with large fins. Let's start with, who's going to talk to me here? How about Easton? Why don't, you can pick one, but you got to tell me one of them. You could pick Lamarck or Darwin. Okay, so what would Darwin have said? Yeah, why it has large fins. They evolved, and so they needed to survive. And that's something that both of them would have said. And so I'm going to put the word survive here in the middle because both guys would have said that the organism needed these to survive. Now we'll be a little bit more specific. You mentioned the word that the organism wanted to survive, or they had needs. So I'm going to put that in the Lamarck section. According to Lamarck, the fish would have used its fins and they would have gotten bigger. So Lamarck's theory is based on the organism wanting to do it or the idea of use and disuse. According to Lamarck, the fish uses its fins, they get bigger. Then the next generation has slightly bigger fins, then they use their fins to glide and they get bigger. And so according to Lamarck, over time, the fact that they used the fins made them be more developed. They used them because they wanted to survive, they wanted to glide. So that's the idea. The organism wanted to glide, so they used their fins. The other word that I'm going to put in the middle is time, because both of these guys agreed that stuff takes a lot of time. Now, what would Darwin have said? Darwin would have said, fish with small fins didn't survive. He would say If you had smaller fins, you could not compete as well. So because there was overproduction, because there were more organisms than the environment could support, the fish with smaller fins that couldn't glide couldn't access the same resources as the fish with large fins. So remember, Darwin's theory is all based on who is the best adapted. Darwin does not say the organism gets to choose or create their characteristics by using them. Darwin says they are born with it. The word that you could use there is the word innate. Organisms have the characteristics. So according to Darwin, a fish was born with larger fins. That made them more able to survive, and so they had a better chance to reproduce and pass that gene on. Now the second part of this, question number 2, says that Lamarck suggested that organisms arise spontaneously and then become increasingly more complex. Discuss why this idea is not supported by the theory of natural selection. So we're going to pause. All right, so I'm going to turn the recording back on here so that we can sum this up. I went around to most of you, and hopefully you're seeing the idea that we're trying to compare the idea of complexity and the idea of survival. Lamarck said an organism starts out simpler and becomes gradually more complex, and that's what evolution is. And so what we're asking here is, does being more complex mean that you are going to survive? And that's not necessarily true. Survival is based on adaptation. Do you have the right characteristics for your environment? Now, perhaps your environment is very simple and you do not need a lot of adaptations to survive there. Or perhaps you need only one really specific adaptation. So the textbook uses the example of a snake. A snake can survive. But is a snake very complex? Well, it specifically mentions in the textbook it doesn't have feet. There are organisms that have more, let's say, body parts, more structures than a snake does. Does that make them better than a snake? Does that mean that they evolved from a snake? And what we're trying to get at is becoming more complex does not mean that you are well adapted for your environment. So the number of structures that you have isn't what makes you evolved, it's whether or not you can survive in your environment. So for what a snake does, it doesn't need feet. It has an alternate mode of transportation, and snakes are very skilled at catching prey, at killing prey. When CSI Miami used to be on TV, it's not anymore, it's too bad, it was awesome. There was an episode where a snake killed a person because it swallowed them whole, but they didn't know what happened to the person because the person was just sitting in a beach chair by the pool covered with goo, and they realized afterwards, oh, it was the snake's killing acid or whatever is in its mouth that caused the person to die. So snakes are well adapted, they can survive, but they're not necessarily as complex as other organisms. So there's a difference there between complexity and survival, and that's what we want to get at. Now we're going to move ahead to page 133, where there were a few more questions that you had to answer. Number 2 is asking you to say some things that are similar between Lamarck and Darwin. So I'm going to repeat a couple of things that I already said. One of them was time. Lamarck and Darwin both agreed that this is not something that happens instantaneously. You need several generations to see the effect of change. The other thing that I mentioned back here is that organisms' survival is the thing that is determining whether or not they evolve, which means both of them agree the environment is a factor. Something about the environment is causing organisms to evolve. Now, their explanation for how that happened was different, but both of them agree that the environment was a factor. They also both agree Oh, geez, let's start all over. They both agree that there are heritable traits. Exactly which traits are heritable and which ones aren't, there's some disagreements there, but both of them agree that things are passed on from parent to offspring. Another thing that both of them agree on is that organisms, specifically populations, change and are still changing. And this is perhaps the most important one, because before this, a lot of people still prescribe to the idea that organisms started out exactly the way they were. There was no change over time. If there was a new species, it didn't come from an existing species, it started that way. So both of them agree that organisms have changed over time and that they are still changing, that the process is not finished, that it's ongoing. So these are some things that are similar between their two theories. So you see, there's a lot. It's just the mechanism for how it happened that they differed on. Now the next question, number 4 on this page, asked you to outline the inferences that Darwin and other scientists made from each of the following observations. So there were 3 observations, and we're asking, what did they sort of decide, or what conclusion did they come to based on what they saw? So A says, some species found on islands are very similar to species found on neighboring continents. What could be the conclusion that we draw from that? I'm going to ask you, because what you said yesterday when we were talking about Darwin's observations was right. So we found things on islands that looked a lot like the continents that were next to them. And you used a word. It started with a G. Like GEO. Yeah. So the idea was that geography made a difference. If you were close in geography to an organism, you probably had similar characteristics, and if you were far away, characteristics were different. So geography affects characteristics. That was one thing. Next thing, B, was that no 2 individuals are exactly alike. What could you conclude by observing that no 2 individuals are exactly alike? That there's what? Say it again. Yeah, there we go. You're on a roll today. There is variation, quite simply. It's one of the points of natural selection. Organisms are different. And because organisms are different, that means that some organisms will have a characteristic and other ones will not. The last thing, resources such as food are limited. So one of the points of natural selection describes what organisms do when resources are limited. Does anyone want to say what happens here? They die because why? And why would they die? So there's not enough resources. They die because who got the resources? The better adapted ones. So there is competition, and adaptation decides who wins the competition. These are all points of natural selection. So these are some of the main ideas that natural selection says. Location is a big factor. The environment helps determine characteristics. There is variation among individuals, and there's competition for limited resources, meaning, like Nolan said, if you don't win, you die. Now the last one is number 6. Number 6 says, an athlete breaks her leg. Years later, she has a child who walks with a limp. Is this an example of a trait being passed on from one generation to the next? And I hope everyone is saying no, which is what I hear. Of course, it's a funny coincidence that she broke her leg and then her child has a limp, but we know that only DNA in the sperm or the egg is passed on. So unless she broke a bunch of her eggs then that's not getting passed on. I don't know what's happening here, but we'll roll with it. So just to make sure that everyone is confident about what the answer should be, here are some things that they would both say. They would both say that it's about survival, and the ones with dirty tongues survived. You could say that for both of them. That would be a true point. They would both say that it happened over time, that it took several generations for the entire population to display this characteristic. But what's the difference? Darwin would say one of these dragons was just born with it. So over here, someone wrote, mom was born with it, kid had a dirty mouth. So if the parent has the characteristic, they're born with it, then it makes sense they should also be able to pass it on to their offspring. Lamarck would say it's the idea of use and disuse. The dragon made their tongue filthier, and it helped them survive, so they kept making it filthier and filthier by licking something with bacteria. So Lamarck says the dragon is doing it on purpose, is making it happen. Darwin is saying, no, they are born with it, and because it helped them survive, over time, this characteristic got passed on because the ones who had it were better at surviving.